a Dram and a Drush. I am delighted to be finishing out this season with a very special episode. We are in the presence of someone who's really offering us a masterclass in Jewish leadership. Dr. Hal Lewis has been teaching about Jewish leadership for many decades. He's also somebody incredibly experienced through his own life experience. He has been the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Columbus, Ohio, and he spent over a decade as president and CEO of the Chicago Spertus College and Institute. He has taught on Jewish leadership in an abundance of places, including the University of Cincinnati, the University of Illinois in Chicago, Brandeis University, Spertus, and Hebrew University. Who is this episode for? We're going to learn a little bit about lowland whiskeys, but then we get into the real drush. If you are a Jewish professional in any aspect of Jewish life, if you are a layperson working on a committee or on a board, or if you're someone who's just interested in how to help Jewish community life move forward and think that you may have something to offer, this truly is the gift of a 1-hour masterclass with someone who has such wisdom to share. And I'm so honored that we get to share it together over a dram in this month's episode. So let me present Dr. Hal Lewis. So Hal, welcome to A Dram and a Drush. It's wonderful to have you here. And I'm going to jump right in. What is the dram that you have brought for us this month?
Well, today I'm going to sample with you I think, one of my absolute favorites, and that is Auchentoshen 3-wood. And as I'm sure we'll get into, there are several different Auchentoshens. This is, the 3-wood is my favorite, and I'm happy to talk about it with you and learn from you and sample it.
Wonderful. Well, the minute you picked it up, the first thing I noticed was the color of it. And actually, I did not check. Does it say on the bottle anything like no color added? Does it specifically say anything about color on the bottle? I forgot to look that up as a detail.
I do not know. I do not see anything to that effect. On the front, as I'm sure we'll talk about, this is the 3-wood is because of 3 separate maturing processes in 3 separate casks, and it delineates the casks. And then on the back, as you also know, this is a triple distilled whiskey, and it talks a little bit about that. And then, I don't know if this is true in other single malt whiskeys, but there is a pronunciation guide printed right on the label, which says Auchentoshen. It explains on the back how to pronounce it, because even if you love it, you certainly want to pronounce it properly.
That's right. It's actually, I think on their website, they're one of their catchphrases is difficult to pronounce, easy to drink.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Yeah.
Because it's the reason I was asking you about the coloring is that there's very strict rules in the making of whiskey, and particularly in the making of Scotch whiskey. They're very precise. One of the few things that they are allowed to add is coloring, and I don't think it's an across the board rule. Often, if a company explicitly says they don't add coloring or says natural coloring, then you know that it is. If it doesn't say that, then you don't know whether they might have added some coloring to sort of for some consistency or to give it a certain look. But that's just such a lovely deep color. If you can hold your glass up again.
I will be happy to.
Yeah, of course. The other reason, and I'm drinking something a little different. You can see mine's quite a different color.
Yes.
This is also from the same part of Scotland. It's a lowland whiskey. It's a lowland blend. But we're going to stick to talking about Auchentoshen. One of the reasons for that beautiful color that you have there is because of those barrels. So it starts in, there's an ex-bourbon barrel, and the whiskey is also then in 2 different kinds of sherry barrel. There's the Oloroso barrel, and then the Pedro Ximenez, the PX barrel. And those sherry barrels in particular are going to add those deeper colors to the whiskey, as well as some really beautiful aromas and tastes. take up your glass and we'll start off. If you can tell me, what are you picking up? When you, this is, I know, a favorite of yours. Tell me what it is that you love about this particular whiskey.
Well, I should say, in keeping with the way I learned, I've already put some water in to release some of the alcohol, cut the surface tension, and so I have a much more pleasant nose than before you add the water, which is not just true for Auchentoshen, obviously. But for me, I do get a combination just in the nose of a little orange and I'm not sure. It feels to me like it might be some vanilla flavoring too. Um, I've read that there's honey. I don't get a strong honey aroma, but I guess everybody's nose is different. But
It
yeah,
is, right.
and it for me it's part of the experience, but it's like the magnet, the invitation to go further than just the nose.
Of course, yes. So oftentimes, when you're smelling a whiskey, you've got those vanilla, maybe butterscotchy notes. That a lot of that is drawn from those bourbon barrels. And then these, as I said, Auchentoshen is a lowland whiskey. Now, it's interesting. There's a lot of debate these days. It used to be, or maybe it used to be, I'm not sure if it was ever so distinctly so, that depending on what region you were in, you would be able to say, oh, the whiskeys in this region, they have a shared style. They have some things in common. And there's still some degree that you can talk about that, but not entirely. There's a lot of variation among the Speyside whiskies.
And maybe
Islay,
that's true about Isla whiskeys, right? That there's a
but
greater
even in
common.
even on Islay, there are now unpeated whiskies. Not every single whiskey on
Uh,
Islay. I mean, the Bruichladdich is they have peated whiskies, but they're Port Charlotte range and they're Octomore. But Bruichladdich is not not a peated whiskey. So even there's variation. But the lowlands have often been associated with whiskies that are seen to be lighter, a little bit more florally, the sort of that butterscotch or, the sweetness that comes through. What some people describe as smooth when they're just talking about something that just doesn't have too much pungency to it. And so Auchentoshen is certainly fits that mold as a style of whiskey. But I don't know how much you can attribute that to the fact that it's a lowlands whiskey as opposed to the process that we'll get into that they use. So what do you pick up? We take a smell. You sometimes sort of breathe it in, and then when you take that first tasting, what are you picking up in this whiskey?
oh, it's here I get a bit more of the honey that I didn't get in the nosing. And what I've noticed about Auchentoshen 3 wood for as long as I've been drinking it is it feels very robust before it feels smooth. It's like the proverbial burn is not anywhere near as intense as it is in some cases. On my tongue, it feels heavy, but when I swallow and go through, I do get the sense this is smooth. This is not arduous. I don't have to work at this. This is so. Um, for me, it's sort of the part of the complexity of the experience with Auchentoshen 3 wood.
Right, and I think some of those sherry barrelings have given it that sort of that explosion of flavor that you get in the mouth is maybe a little bit of cinnamon, but also you've got raisins and
Mm.
the plums, the kind of those sort of dark slash sweet fruits that you get with a sherry finish. But the smoothness, the experience you have of a light whiskey when it goes down is partly to do with, I think, the way it's distilled. So as you mentioned, what's one of the other things that's unique about this particular whiskey is it's the only single malt whiskey in Scotland that is triple distilled. Usually, when you hear the term triple distilled, that's more likely to be something you're going to find in an Irish whiskey.
Yeah.
And what happens is there's a couple of things that happens each time you put your liquid through an additional distillation. First of all, every time you do an additional distillation, you're going to lose a little bit more of the water that was sort of left in the in the liquid, and you're going to get a more intensely alcoholic product. So actually, most whiskeys, when they're double distilled, they're going to come out somewhere in the sort of 70 something percentage. Sometimes high 60. It's going to get often watered down a little bit, even to go into the barrel. But this is coming out at after the third distillation at 81%, which is very, very high alcohol. I mean, that's kind of wash your hands kind of type alcohol level, 81%. But the other thing that they're getting when they do that triple distillation is every time you distill, you're losing some of the impurities, some of the other kinds of esters, and some of the other types of chemical elements that are mixed in with the alcohol. And in some whiskeys, they're going for that. They want some level of that. That's part of what gives mouthfeel and flavor. When you distill that away, you're getting something that's lighter, that's much more floral. And at the end, that I think that experience you have when you swallow it, of that sort of, just a lighter weight liquid, the way it flows down, that's part of that process of how they have distilled it. So then the body, what you're getting in terms of flavor and the things that you're tasting, that's really coming much, much more from the wood, from the barrels that they're putting it in. So the 3 wood, by drawing on 3 different kinds of barrels, is really doing something, an interesting process of balancing and blending those 3 influences.
And I don't know enough to know how this works, but the 2 sherries and 1 oak, I feel just are coming together in some kind of magical formulation. I've obviously had oak, and I've had, like a Macallan sherry casks only. There's something about this that I find truly comforting, relaxing, all in kind of experience. It's really remarkable, and it's why I enjoy it so much.
In some ways, when you know when you make a good whiskey and you've been making it a certain way for a certain length of time, when you're buying things like single casks, you can have a really good cask and put that out, and bottle it, 200, 300 bottles of one particular cask. But the artistry of really good whiskey making is often in how it's being blended. So that might be blending, different wood finishes or different ages, but it's that master blending that really is the art of making good whiskey. And I think that Auchentoshen, the 3 wood in particular, really highlights the skill that they have, and they should be good at it by now. I mean, they've been at it for a while. The distillery was established in 1823.
Yeah.
Although the three wood is a much newer output for them. They launched the 3 wood in 2002. So it's only been around for about 20 years. And increasingly they're doing others. Yes,
it was worth waiting for. I've had other Auchentoshes that I enjoy less, more because I think, to my palate, more oak, less sherry. That's something that matters to me in my tasting. And so the sherry is potent without being overwhelming. As I was trying to say before, it's robust, but it's still smooth in the entirety of the process.
Right. And certainly from my tasting of Auchentoshen, I said I didn't have a bottle in the house at this moment, but when I've tasted it before, I agree. I think the 3 wood does stand out as one of the more exceptional of their core lineup that they bring out each year. I did mention that it's in the Lowlands, the sort of band that's the sort of the southernmost strip of Scotland. And actually, the Lowlands once upon a time was a very, very vibrant whiskey producing area with one of the largest for a period of Scotland's whiskey making history, but then really lost a great deal of their distilleries, so that we're down to about six separate distilleries in the lowlands. And yet, despite the small number, and not all of those are available to visit, so that you can't go and do a tour of all of them. Auchentoshen you can. The output, the whiskey output of the distilleries in the lowland areas is actually still quite enormous, because what you find is a lot of blended whiskies. They are being produced in the lowland area, even if they might be drawing on peated whiskies, or sourcing their whiskies from a variety of places. The grain distilleries using things other than single malt. A lot of that is being done in the lowland areas, and when you are distilling other grains, the process is different and the throughput can be different, and so they're producing a very large amount of whiskey. Just can't give you the tiny little island of Islay has more distilleries that you can point to with distinctive single malts than you can in the lowlands. But like everywhere, I'm seeing that there's a little bit of a revival. There are some distilleries that had been what they call mothballed, that have been closed, that are now reopening, and they're going to produce again. I think Rosebank is one of those lowland distilleries. And then you have brand new distilleries like Lochlear that just opened a few years ago, and are just now in these last year or so have put out their very first whiskies. And this is one of these sort of farm to bottle type distilleries that I saw has just arrived on the shelves in my local liquor store in the last few months. So I'm eager to try that, but that would be another really brand new lowland whiskey. So if you like the style of Auchentoshen, I'm just saying, is sort of take a look around. Beautiful. Because there's a couple of others that are just starting to emerge that maybe share some of these characteristics, if geography has anything to do with it. Well, we're going to shift from our dram to our drush, and I know through our drush we might come back to whiskey, but as is often the case, I go back and forth with these podcast episodes between talking to people who are working in the whiskey industry and are whiskey experts, and those who enjoy a dram, as do you and I, but that's not our area of expertise, but we bring something else to the table. And Hal, for those who have not had a chance to meet you at other occasions, your area of expertise is really in Jewish leadership. And you have quite a remarkable career in terms of where you yourself have been a leader and the work you've done for really significant institutions in the Jewish world. And now you're sort of taking some of that skill set forward as a consultant and providing us, guidance to others. So give us a little bit of background in terms of where have you been working in the Jewish world over the decades, and some of the things that you've observed and seen as what makes leadership in the Jewish world something that that we hold up when it's at its best.
Well, I should say, on a sort of pedestrian basis, I've lived and worked in Jewish communal organizations for almost my entire career, beginning doing youth work when I was younger, and moving into served as a synagogue executive director and a federation CEO, and I was the president of a college of Jewish studies for 10 years. And so on the one hand, professionally, I've made my living in and around Jewish communal settings in which leadership is a leitmotif, an ongoing theme that we look at. For me, I've always had one foot in the academic arena as well as in the let's say the community world, fundraising, organizational development, board work, so on and so forth. And so for me, my academic area of pursuit early on was the broad arena, often ill-defined, of Jewish leadership. For me, that meant really two things. One is, how have Jewish communities throughout history organized themselves, and what leadership paradigms have emerged from the way communities have in fact organized themselves? And this is post-destruction of the temple in Bavel to the Jewish communities in Europe, Ashkenazi, Sephardi communities, as we go through time, the early modern period, and certainly my interest, having worked in organizations, is also sort of modern Jewish history. My particular focus is diaspora communities for reasons that I'm happy to explain, but just in brief. And the second part of that is what, and I hope you'll forgive my cynicism, in contrast to the stereotypical obligatory Devar Torah about Moses at the start of a board meeting, I've made an academic study of principles of effective leadership that emerge from sacred and classical sources. And so I don't have to tell you, but we have a number of models from the big three in the biblical period: priest, prophet, and king, and the variations, but the evolution of leadership typologies and lessons of leadership. Much of my work has been, if we're going to call ourselves in 2023 Jewish leaders, that should mean more than just the cultural focus of the organizations we serve. And it should be able to at least talk to us about what does it mean to be a Jewish leader, not merely a leader who's Jewish, and not merely a leader who, in contemporary terms, is working in a Jewish setting, but what does it mean to be a Jewish leader, whether we are clergy, rabbis, cantors, whether we're educators, whether we're fundraisers, whether we're community relations advocates. So my two areas of interest are how have communities organized and what are the principles around which they have organized, such that we can see evidence of them even today in 2023.
Well, I find that fascinating, just as a framework, as a different way of looking at things, because you're right. When I think about it, why would Jewish leadership that would be sort of grounded in models that we might derive from our own sort of evolving history be different from just taking sort of the best advice that's out there about good leadership and applying it, to the synagogue setting, the Jewish nonprofit, whatever it is, and clearly you have a case to make based on the research you've done that it does make a difference to be grounded, to be anchored in something that's evolved out of our own sort of cultural historical evolution. So, could you maybe illustrate that with a particular example that would help us see how that plays out?
From my point of view, I just want to clarify one thing. Mine is not a triumphalist approach to Jewish leadership. That is to say, I don't believe that we always have all the answers from our own tradition. I'm a fan of Maimonides' conclusion that we should consider the truth regardless of the source. And so I believe we have a lot to learn from contemporary best practice studies of leadership, from things we can learn from the military, things we've learned from other approaches to leadership. My position is that should not be to the exclusion of our own sources and insights that make us in 2023 potentially better rabbis, better federation executives, better programmers, better Jewish innovators by taking from this world and from that world. Let me give you, I think, one area where it's pretty clear. There is a dominant theory of leadership that was very popular even up to and through the 1980s. If you looked at American business schools and sort of the general literature on leadership. And it's premised on a theory made popular by Thomas Carlyle, which we refer to as the great man theory of leadership. Now, as you know, sometimes at various times in history, we use the term man to mean human. But that's not true with the great man theory of leadership. the great man theory of leadership means a man, and it means an elitist, top-down command and control approach. It means, as Plato said in his writings about the philosopher king, some are destined to lead and some are not. There are, we sometimes refer to the great man theory also as trait theories of leadership. And while I don't think it's completely true to say Jewish sources have none of that, the reality is Jewish approaches to leadership come from an entirely different place. You know, the Hebrew word for leader is manhig, leadership, manhigut, that has, as many Hebrew words, a three-letter root, a three-letter shoresh, nun he gimel, which means behavior. Leadership in Jewish circles is not about who your father was, what your gender is, how handsome you look, but rather what is your behavior, and do you embrace principles of boldness, decisiveness, sometimes swimming against the trend. And so there is a difference between manhigut, a Jewish approach to leadership, and the great man theory of leadership. Does that mean there isn't some crossover? Of course there is. We have messianic figures in our history. We are familiar with a male-dominated approach to leadership for much of our writing. So it's not an exclusive or purist, but I do think Jewish sources on effective leadership present us, challenge us, particularly those of us working in the trenches of Jewish life, with an alternative approach to effective leadership. And that, for me, at least, is something we who lead in Jewish community life should know about. I'm not saying we're not also influenced by other models, but as Jewish leaders, that should mean something more than we work in a Jewish organization.
Mm-hmm. So I'm really struck, and I know I have this conversation sometimes with colleagues of mine, that for those of us who are rabbis, and obviously that's different to being head of a federation or some other kind of Jewish nonprofit, but for those of us who are rabbis, I got relatively little training as part of my seminary education in leadership, and yet it's such an essential part of the work that I have to do in my community. I took all the classes in the history and the philosophy and the theology, and learned the ritual skills and pastoral training. All of that was part of it, but actual leadership training and thinking about the sort of the Jewish elements that you have focused on, I have to say that I think that was a pretty, I've subsequently gone and looked for those opportunities in fellowships and programs and courses. So I've taken advantage of opportunities to do things like that, but it wasn't part of the foundation of my training. So if you're setting out a landscape for someone who is aspiring to take on some of these positions, what are some of the qualities that you would hold up that you think we ought to be developing within ourselves, and things we ought to be self-aware about in the leadership work that we might seek to do?
Sure. I think that there we can extrapolate from a variety of sources. It's not, I've written 2 academic books on leadership. And one of the things that became clear to me is I was writing books that contained sources known to many, but never synthesized and put together. I mean, to be dramatic about it, there is no Masechet, there is no tractate of the Talmud, Manhigut, right? If we want to know how to be an effective leader versus other aspects of Jewish life and Jewish law over time, there's no singular place to go. I wrote a book called From Sanctuary to Boardroom, a Jewish approach to leadership, in which I tried to put together for non-subject specialists texts and sources and sort of data points that we should be exploring and thinking about as we lead. What is the relationship? And this certainly has 21st century ramifications. What ought the relationship be between our leaders, whether those leaders are our clergy or our philanthropic leaders, governance leaders, or anything in between. What ought that relationship be with stakeholders, with followers? What is, in Jewish sources, including some very unlikely Hasidic sources, we find a real unapologetic emphasis on reciprocity. Most of us don't think about leadership as being a reciprocal relationship. In fact, in the days when we used to have bookstores in the United States, you'd walk into the business section and the focus and the shelf on leadership, and you'd get the impression that leadership was entirely top down, right? Leaders here, followers here, bark out command and control. If you read Jewish sources on what makes leaders effective, or even what makes them ineffective, returns us to this question of reciprocity in leadership. There's a traditionally, the Hasidic literature tends to be very top down. The tzaddik, the Rebbe, and his Hasidim, his followers. But if you look at Hasidic literature on the relationship between leader and follower, you find a very different approach. One of my favorite is a Israel of Rishon text that analogizes the Hasid and the Rebbe, that is the follower and the leader, as consonants and vowels in the Hebrew language. With the consonant, you can only go so far. You don't understand how to pronounce the word. And with the vowels, absent a consonant, you're lost. This favorite Hasidic text of mine talks about the fact that rabbis need their parishioners, right? Philanthropists, professionals in sort of fundraising organizations, program people, social service people, camping people, Hillel professionals. If we lose this sense of reciprocity and we fall victim to sort of the Western great man theory of leadership, leaders up here, followers down there, we miss something. Now, there is some evidence of that from general studies. Famously, Barbara Kellerman at Harvard wrote a book called Followership. And there is some warming to this idea of the role of followers in leadership. But that's woven into the fiber of very early Jewish sources.
Right, and as you're describing that, what comes to me is that there are individuals who have done some remarkable things, have created some wonderful new ideas and startups within the Jewish community, often with a lot of charisma and a lot of energy, a lot of vision. And sometimes those become the establishment of something that builds and grows. But the projects like that seem to me to really have the legs to build and to grow are the ones where that reciprocity, where those followers, the ones who said, that sounds like a good idea, we'd like to join you, that over time there has to be an evolution in that partnership. And where that doesn't happen, and it's just based around sort of some focus on ego, however
quasi-messianic, yeah.
Right. They tend to implode. So I think
right.
that gets to something that I think that you've I know spoken about and written about quite a bit, which is, and to me is it's a balancing. One has to have a certain degree of I don't know if the word is self-confidence or presence to be a leader in certain ways, but equally important is the quality of humility and keeping those in check. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the role of humility in leadership.
It's related to the larger sense of what I referenced earlier. It's called, sometimes referred to as trait theory. A leader needs to look a certain way, sound a certain way. If you think about the history of at least the biblical leadership paradigms, right? Our leaders were inarticulate to the point of embarrassment. Think the Moses story, were the last people who wanted the job, if you will, think about the prophets, think about, again, the Moses case, and the most reliant upon a team approach. That is, again, the notion that I can't do it myself. And if I'm doing it myself, I'm falling into the pattern of things we have dismissed in Jewish life, like pharaohs, like my way or the highway. I alone can address it. These are not models traditionally of Jewish leadership, though I want to be clear, a careful study of Jewish history shows us that we have had some examples of that. But you are right. The beginning in the Torah, where we learn that the greatest Jewish leader, whether this has historicity or not, is beside the point. But the greatest Jewish leader, at least reputed in our sacred sources, was Moses, who, as I said, is also referred to in the biblical text as the most humble human being on earth. Now, I believe, and I think we have evidence to suggest that that's not coincidental. It's not, here was this guy who was humble and he turns out to be a great leader. No, I believe that his humility made him a great leader. And by the way, fast forward, I believe that our humility as leaders make us better leaders as well. And to your point, I'd like to say, unfortunately, those of us who grew up in a Western value system tend to think of humility as analogous to weakness. Let me say, if I can, I don't know how to say this as strongly as I believe it, nothing could be further from the truth. Only a confident leader can afford to be humble. Only a confident leader is willing to say, I don't know, without risking that the world's going to come to an end because somehow they're expected to have all the answers. Only a confident and secure leader is willing to say, Rachel, what do you think? To surround yourself by people with perspectives and expertise that are not carbon copies. The great teacher of leadership, Peter Drucker, used to say carbon copies are weak. But to be willing to surround ourselves by people with a diversity of expertise, perspectives, backgrounds, and that comes not from arrogance, but that comes from humility, which is anything but weakness. So the notion of a confident leader who is also humble ought not be antithetical. There is this concept I've written about before, which philosophers and students of leadership sometimes refer to as epistemological modesty. Epistemology, as you know, is how we know things. What does it mean to say epistemological modesty? It means the ability to say, whether it's you and your congregation or my clients in their overnight camps, or wherever people are on the spectrum of Jewish leadership, it allows us to say, I think I am right, but I might be wrong. What an astounding insight into really effective leadership. If I think I'm right, then I'm not a wimp, I'm not rolling over, I'm not a weakling, but I recognize that I might be wrong means I darn well better surround myself by people who have other perspectives. Drucker used to say, not a Jewish source, but this is what I was trying to say before about learning from a variety of sources. Peter Drucker used to say, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Now, it doesn't mean we'll always have to rely on others. Sometimes they want our expertise. You're the congregational rabbi, right? Someone else is the head of another organization. So it's not about weakness, but it's about allowing humility to help us make better decisions, to understand where we need help, to be willing to show vulnerability, right? There is nothing a leader can do that will enhance her ability to make her team accountable then by her own willingness to stand up and say, I'm not sure. Not I'm not sure forever. I'm not sure I have to get the answer. But I'm not sure because it's not endemic to my role as leader to have all the answers in this sort of pseudo-Renaissance person notion of having all the answers. So I'm a huge proponent. It was sort of like the way I started learning about single malt Scotch. I'm a huge proponent of humility, not to be afraid. Some people, as you know, I'm sure, have this need to always be right, even if they don't know what the heck they're talking about. A great writer on leadership, Patrick Lencioni, calls that terminal correctness. When I started drinking single malt whiskey, I couldn't afford to have terminal correctness. I didn't know what I was doing. And so I surrounded myself by experts. I read, and and it's obviously not a perfect metaphor, but I think the same is very much true. I work with a lot of volunteers who sit on boards of our organizations, and we've always had a sector of the Jewish community who were not clergy and were not educators. They were volunteers, sometimes because they had financial resources, sometimes because they had connections in the broader community. But they learned to ask of others, and their wisdom was sought by others. And it's related to humility. I sometimes refer to it as collaboration, as another attribute of effective leadership. When I started learning about whiskey, and I have roots in Scotland. My paternal grandfather was from Edinburgh, but I didn't know him. I'm named for him. But I learned to ask a lot of questions, and I think we've somehow made it part of a mythology that if we ask too many questions as a leader, we're not doing our job. We're somehow derelict in our responsibility. But the opposite is true. Look at classical sources. We were always surrounded by diverse perspectives. The Mishnah in our vote talks about 3 crowns of leadership: Torah, Kehuna, Malchut, education, religious practice, and this sort of work in society. And healthy Jewish communities always brought them together. No one ever dominated the leadership landscape. And I think the same is true for a lot of things. For me, it was true because I wanted to learn about single malt whiskey, and I knew I didn't have the answers, and I knew I needed to read, talk, visit. I made my first trip to Scotland to learn more about it. So so I think it's a key part of how leaders become effective.
Yeah, and I think you could take that sort of allegory of whiskey a little further. I was thinking about that even in terms of your choice for today, because we talked about how the very specific process of distillation makes Auchentoshen unique amongst single malts. And on the one hand, it means that the base spirit is quite light. It's not carrying a whole lot of very complex character necessarily in the initial distillation because of that triple distillation, but yet it has its own specific character. So it's not devoid of character. That's its core character, but it is designed in such a way as to respond beautifully to the wood and these different wood sources, right, in order to absorb and to take in the best of what those different woods have to offer and to bring them together. So I hear from everything you've said is that's kind of a nice analogy for leadership.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, another one I was thinking of, and I know for some this will be a Drash too far, if you will, but for me, when I was first learning, I learned about the value of a drop of water in Scotch. Now, you don't have to drink it that way. Obviously, many people don't. But the person that taught me this left me with a lasting metaphor, which I think has application to effective leadership, admittedly, as a Drash. when you take a whiskey before you drop in some water, and then drop in a little bit of water, not just does it break the surface tension on a technical level, but as I learned, it's like walking through a rose garden after a light rain. Beforehand, there's a certain aroma and a certain experience. After a light rain, the aroma, the entire gestalt of it, we can't maximize the whiskey tasting experience without the water. We can't maximize the leadership experience without the functional equivalent of dropping our own bit of spring water, by which I mean surrounding ourselves by other perspectives. There's such a rush to sort of make decisions in our communal organizations. We're afraid of the dynamic of discussion because we're in a rush. We have to make a decision. Jewish communal leaders have always been in a rush, but because the system allows us to balance and counterbalance, like the little bit of water that enriches the whiskey experience. For me, this is a very powerful metaphor. And in my own leadership work, I've tried to learn from that. Of course, there are days when we just like to make a decision, right? We don't have time for the functional equivalent of dropping water and surrounding ourselves. But when we have challenging, adaptive decisions that we need to make, none of us is as smart as all of us. And that's woven into the whole millennia of Jewish leadership practice. And I find it to be equally resonant, maybe more resonant, in a world such as the one we live in today.
Right. Certainly within, congregational life, which is where I've been working almost all of my career, I see that play out. More and more, the success of what we do and the engagement and the excitement of the membership, the people who are part of our communities, is comes from creating the opportunities for them to blossom. Right, the skills, the what we bring to the table. More and more, we used to sort of go hunting for the expert speakers to bring in for the big fancy presentations, and there's still, of course, there's a place for that, to have the famous author and but more and more when you draw on the expertise that's within your own community, so that people are not just getting to hear great ideas, but are also getting to hear them come from amongst us, from whoever that the community defines itself, that the way in which we build a sense of connectedness and a sense of community strength from hearing those voices and empowering them is beyond anything, any program that any individual could possibly bring in to present.
Our job as leaders isn't about superimposing our will. That it's tempting sometimes, and there are times when we are the smartest person in the room with the most experience, to paraphrase Drucker. But our job as leaders is growing the leadership of others. This was, and I know many of your listeners will know this, this is the story of Yitro and Moshe, of Jethro and his son-in-law Moses. Moses, who was so sure he could do it all. He had all the answers. And he said he had the stamina to do it all. Jethro wasn't worried about Moses' stamina. What Jethro says in Shemot, in the book of Exodus, he says to Moses, you doing everything is not right for the people. It's not that it's not right for you, that you're going to burn out, right? But what you do is not right for the people, because our job as leaders is to grow, exactly what you said, is to grow the leadership of others. And if in the process it takes a little longer, it will. And if in the process we may have some quality control issues, that might be the case. But overall, when we're done, our legacy as leaders are the leaders we grew and the leadership we help them embrace, and along the way, we embrace it. We're better leaders because of a willingness to um, say, I think I'm right, but I might be wrong, and I can't do this job by myself, because no Jewish leader has successfully done it by herself or by himself. Whether we're talking about secular things like the Zionist movement or religious trends or sort of the general rabbinic take on Jewish approaches to things. This is an amalgamation and a willingness to say, leadership does not mean I have all the answers, but it does mean my job is to grow the leadership of others.
Right, right. So as we kind of bring things a little bit towards a close, and maybe we'll come back to our whiskey drush and our analogies one more time with some of these themes. Are there particular places that you see in the Jewish community when you sort of look out the landscape that excite you at the moment, where you think that there's things that are starting to arise or flourish, particularly as we sort of emerge post-pandemic, that you would suggest we have our eyes on?
First, I want to acknowledge that I inadvertently didn't respond to your observation that you didn't learn a lot of this in rabbinic school. I want to assure you that Hillel professionals are struggling with the same thing, and overnight camping professionals in the arts and culture arena and the social service arena. We tend to focus on tasks. As a rabbi, you need to know a certain amount of text. You need to have certain pastoral skills, right? But you're not trained typically to think of yourself as the leader of a community. And as you, I'm sure, could say better than I, one of the rude awakenings that many in the clergy find out is what it means to work with donors, what it means to work with a board, what it means to, I've been trained to think of myself this way, and then the cold, hard reality is something else. I did want to say at the time, that's really not so different from other categories of leadership. Today, we live in a world where anybody and her uncle can take a course in Jewish leadership, but they tend to often be skill set transmission. How to run a good meeting, how to write a better press release, how to maximize social media. It's not really the same thing as the kind of thing we're talking about. And so when I feel privileged every time I have the opportunity to do a deeper dive on what does it mean to lead in a Jewish fashion, not to the exclusion of other insights into effective leadership. So what excites me? I want to say there's a lot going on in Jewish life that excites me. Do I love the fact that we are moving further and further away from gender inequities? Yeah. Are we there? No. But do I love that we're moving further there? Do I love that we've become wiser about the diversity of the Jewish community in terms of Jews of color and a variety of other previously cast as peripheral segments of the community that are now shifting what some people like to call our Ashkenormative sensibilities into something wider. I also love and respect the fact that many of the legacy organizations in Jewish life, which I frankly think have gotten a bad deal, restored their value in the post-COVID world, right? Everybody says, "Whoa, we don't like this, it's too centralized, it's too whatever." And yet, at times of great challenge, we turn to those centralized organizations, our JCCs, our federations, so on and so forth. So there is a lot that excites me in living in Jewish life. I must be honest and say I'm not so excited about how we're dealing with new leaders and even existing leaders. In the work I do as an executive coach and organizational consultant, I cannot tell you how many times I hear professionals and lay leaders not knowing how to work together. Lay leaders invited to sit on a board who don't know what it means to be a nonprofit governance leader. Sadly, some of our professional colleagues have have missed the message about partnering with lay leaders, about that collaborative model, about, if you will, the drop of water that enhances the totality of the experience. We can't be the only ones who write the roadmap. And so I'm excited about some things happening in Jewish life. To be sure, I'm not a glass half empty guy, except maybe when it comes to my Dram. But there are some deeply troubling things. If in fact Jewish life is shifting, this sort of old boys network of philanthropists making decisions, that's good that that's shifting. But what are we doing? How are we thinking about leadership in 2023 and beyond? I think we have a lot of work to do. And from my point of view, as I said at the start, being a Jewish leader is more than working for a Jewish organization, being Jewish yourself, or what I somewhat sarcastically refer to as the obligatory Dvar Torah about Moses. I think we have a long way to go there. And for as long as I'm able to do so, I'm committed to making sure we think about these things. You don't have to read a text the same way I read the text. You don't have to approach leadership challenges the same way I do. But we should know what our sources ask us to consider. They are data points in the universe of what it means to be a 21st century Jewish leader. And I hope we'll do more of that.
Well, I hope so too. And I think this has been for those who perhaps haven't thought about leadership in this kind of holistic way, beyond the tasks and the jobs that need to get done, that this is a wonderful introduction to at least reframing and thinking about where might each of us benefit from developing our skill set, developing the ways we work relationally with the various cohorts that we work with. So thank you for the opportunity. You've brought sort of some really inspiring ideas, as well as a beautiful whiskey to share with us for this particular month's podcast. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to meet you and hope that our paths will cross again. I will certainly be picking up some of your teachings on leadership, I think, to share with my colleagues and to share with my lay leadership, because there's a lot there that I think we have been, reflecting on and building upon. But there's always much more work to be done. So with that, I want to hold my glass up one more time and invite you to do the same. Thank you so much for joining us on a Dram and a Josh, and L'chaim.
L'chaim to you, and thanks for all the work you're doing. This is a wonderful project. Really enjoy it.
It was such a pleasure to meet and learn from Dr. Hal Lewis. That episode came about because Hal, having heard my first episode at the beginning of the season, contacted me and said, I think I have a Dram and a Drash to share with you. So I want to encourage others who might be listening, who think that they have a story to share, some wisdom to share over a dram of whiskey, to be in touch over the summer. I'm starting to reach out to guests to prepare for season 2 that will be kicking up again in the fall, starting in September. We're going to take a break over the summer, but I hope that you'll be back to join me. Season 2 is going to be that balance that we've had in season 1 of whiskey professionals who happen to be Jewish and Jewish professionals who happen to love whiskey. And I look forward to sharing their stories, their wisdom, and learning a little bit about whiskey and enjoying it together as we continue on our journey. So for the end of season 1, I want to say thank you to all who have been listening and supporting. It's been wonderful, the response and the downloads on YouTube and places where people pick up their audio podcasts. I'm really so grateful that you've been on the journey with me. And I hope you found the conversations enlightening, interesting, and maybe learned a little bit about a whiskey on the side. For now, I just want to wish you all a good summer and say, L'chaim.